All right, guys, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. This is the author series. In the series, I work with authors who are really doing amazing work, and I take a deep dive into the books they're doing on topics of mental health, whether that be trauma, addiction, mindfulness. In this series, I want to start with Donald Altman. Donald, welcome.
Hey, hi, Guy. It's great to be
All right.
here.
Thank you. So Donald is a psychotherapist and award-winning author and a former Buddhist monk. He was featured in the Mindfulness Movie and profiled in the Living Spiritual Teachers Project. He's written over 15 books that teach how to incorporate mindfulness into daily life. Donald has served the community for many years as past vice president of the Center for Mindful Eating and as an adjunct professor in the interpersonal neurobiology program at Portland State University. As a national speaker for PESI, Donald has trained thousands of mental health professionals on changing the brain through mindfulness practices. All right, once again, welcome, Donald. Before we dive in here, share with our listeners where you're from and where you're calling from.
Okay, well, I'm from Chicago, from the Midwest. In my 30s, I left the cold, frigid winters there. I still have a fond spot for Chicago, and I live in Portland, Oregon now.
Oh, nice. All right.
Outside of maybe just about, Portland's unique. I'm only about 30 minutes out, but it's very much kind of rural out here.
Very cool. So the goal here with the author series, unlike the podcast where we really focus on the journey of my guest here, the goal here is to really focus on your book and your work, and specifically we're going to be talking about this book here, Reflect, which I've been diving into. And before we started recording, I said I'm really enjoying it, and let's. Before we take a deep dive, share with our listeners a little bit. Let's give us a little background into the nutshell version of your story, and then we'll kind of segue into the book, if that's okay.
Yeah, I actually been a writer for many years and worked on a lot of different kinds of projects, but I went through a difficult period in my life, and I think that many of us, when we go through, it was related to old trauma, and that if we're not overwhelmed by that, sometimes we find a path. And mine was I went into a monastery and I ordained for a period of time in a Theravada, which is the old school of Buddhism. And really because I met this wonderful teacher, his name was U Thilananda. He came here in the late 70s from Burma. And he was a wonderful teaching monk. And what really touched me when I met him was this palpable sense of availability and compassion that he had. And in that time of my suffering, I wondered how did he transform? He wasn't always like that, right? How did he become like that? And so I found out a short time later, I could ordain with him as the head of the monastery. And it was really, for me personally, it was a very transformational period. I think I was ready for the experience. I'd always done a lot of spiritual readings, and I'd always loved reading Krishnamurti and some different Hindu philosophies. But somehow at this particular time in my life, kind of the practical nature of the Buddhist practice kind of spoke to me, and it just made sense. And I think that's why we have so many spiritual paths, is that everybody might resonate with a different path. And one of the things that U Thilananda loved to do, I discovered, was to teach the loving kindness meditation and practice. And there's even been research showing that if people do this kind of compassion practice for, the Dalai Lama's monks have actually been put under MRIs and shown that it's actually changed significantly how their brain functions. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what had happened to U Thilananda on a brain level, but it's something that was very real for me. And so it really transformed how I experienced other people in my life, and inwardly how I related really at a most basic fundamental level to my thoughts and my emotions. And it's an ongoing process. I don't want anyone to think that suddenly you like a light bulb turns on, and
Right.
it's a process, and it's a continuing process for me. But it's something that I really love teaching and helping people understand. I think that the role that we have as clinicians in our field is a beautiful one, because I think our role is to hold compassion. If you break down the word compassion, it means to be with suffering. And so there aren't too many people in our lives who might be able to sit with us in an open, compassionate, present way. But I think that's one of the gifts that we have as clinicians, therapists, is to offer that very special gift of compassion and sitting in this compassionate way. And I actually have exercises in my workshops that focus on that. And that's one of the things I also wanted to bring into this book, of course. But for my own personal path has been really one of trying to find, how do we connect more? How do we really find more of that authentic self, even those broken parts in ourselves? I know in a lot of your other podcasts, you have people mention a quote, and I don't know if that's part of this, but there's a couple of quotes that I really like.
I'd
And
love to hear them. Yeah.
one is from Inayat Khan, who was who founded the Sufi Order of the West, and he was back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he said, "Taking the sword against another is war. Taking the sword against oneself is peace." So I see that as kind of cutting away the ego, cutting away at the maybe false parts of ourself, right? Another quote that I like, we can go to Leonard Cohen, the singer, songwriter, and I love what he said, "There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And so to see and to reveal those parts that are often hidden from ourselves, that's what I have tried to do within myself, that I think is a wonderful gift everybody can give themselves. And so that's been part of my journey, and what I try to do with Reflect as a book was to help people see some of those hidden parts and start to recognize them, start to embrace them actually, and accept them
Yeah.
as a whole part of themselves.
I love what you're talking about here. I just want to remind everyone that I'm speaking with Donald Altman. The book is Reflect, Awaken to the Wisdom of the Here and Now. So when you were ordained, just a little bit of chronology here, were you a psychotherapist at that time? Give us a little chronology of when that happened.
That was in the late 90s. I was not a therapist at the time, which was kind of the wonderful, kind of the magical aspect of it, that it turned my life in a direction I could not have anticipated. And as a result of that experience, I wrote my first spiritual book called Art of the Inner Meal, Eating as a Spiritual Path. And when I was doing workshops in that area, I would have people coming to me and kind of at the end of the workshop, and in kind of hushed tones saying, "Hey, I've got this eating issue," and they'd be describing some bulimic or anorexic behavior. And I really didn't know how to work with them in that way. That spurred me to go back to school. I went back to grad school and to get my master's, and so that I could become a clinician and work with them. And then I actually worked in an eating disorder clinic for over 4 years. But that really spurred me, that experience in the monastery spurred me to move my life in a new direction. And I am so grateful for that. I couldn't have predicted how that would have turned out. And it changed my direction of my writing as well.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting to me, because it makes me think about the importance of inner work for people who are working not only in this field, and maybe even more specifically trauma and so forth, and eating disorders are in there as well. And this is something I talk a lot about on this podcast. And when you and I were first kind of communicating via email, you said to me, I'm really happy that, or it's nice to see that you're making space for these types of topics in your work. And I thought to myself, yeah, I mean, to me, this is it. And this book, I want to ask you why you wrote this book. But one thing I do want to say, Donald, is, when I started reading this, and um, I mean, I'll ask you to kind of to describe it more, but you have it broken down into several categories, if you will, and within each category, there are, I don't know what they're kind of, you've written, what would you call them? Almost thoughts, or, for example, the one I've kind of earmarked here: everything in your life is already enough.
Mm.
Everything in your life is already enough. And you go, I'm going to read it here. You go on to say, step off the treadmill of unquenchable desire where nothing is ever good enough, where envy and jealousy are thorny companions. When you value and appreciate what is already in your life, you attain liberation from endless comparison and negative emotions. The joy of simplicity is right in front of you. Let go of more and find peace. Reflect on this. And it's almost, I think, telling to say that I'm racing. I think a lot of us are racing, and we're kind of looking for something, and we feel we need something. And this just really spoke to me. And it's almost really something that I'm kind of struggling with, is just believing in myself that I am good enough.
Mm.
So let me just put that out there, and that's one of the little chapters, many chapters that really resonated with me. But I just want to put that out there as a starting point. Share with our listeners why you did write this book, and how you structured it.
And actually, I'm glad you chose that particular reading, because it does kind of point out that we are on a treadmill. And that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is I feel that the ability for sustained attention, which is something that actually wires our brain up in a particular way, allows us to focus, to look inward, is being really splintered, fractured, diminished by having so many distractions throughout the day. And I mean, I hear this from so many people that they have trouble just slowing down the mind, just slowing down ourselves, first of all, but slowing down the mind. And I think technology has, in some way, for all the benefits it has, it also has sped us up internally. And think of all the pop-up windows, all little things trying to grab our attention. And then you have to wonder, at some level, how many of these intentions, or how many of these things that are grabbing me and making me think, oh, I want that, or I need this, are really what I want. I mean, how can we start to really explore our own needs and not have them be prompted by all these external kinds of events? And so what I wanted to do was create something that would be a mindfulness practice for the 21st century, when we all are on the go all the time, when we're being assaulted in some way by all of these messages. How can we come back to this present moment? And so I thought a short reading where you could look at it, you could even, and my suggestion is, reflect on it throughout the day. So just pause throughout the day. And when you pause and reflect inward, you're actually strengthening that, what I like to think of it as the reflect module of the brain, this prefrontal cortex. But it's the part of the brain that allows us to have social connection. It allows us to look inward. And so to just pause and to strengthen that, and to have a reading as a focus for that. It's kind of like when you're driving, it's like a steering wheel. I think of intention, it's an intentional practice. And intentionality is kind of like it's the steering wheel of our vehicle, right? it gets us back on the road. If we're not paying attention, that car can drift off. And so what I wanted to do was to provide something that was gently, each of these readings, something that was maybe gently provocative, something that would maybe shatter some, even just for a moment, some old patterns, ways of thinking or behaving about things, opening up the mind for greater flexibility, greater mindset, and also connecting with who are we? Who am I? At my deepest level, what do I really want? Not what some company wants and is going to throw a pop-up window on my screen. And they're getting so good at that. Artificial intelligence is really maybe for the first time competing, and I'm not the first one to say this, but it might be competing with our sense of who we are. Because very quickly with these algorithms prompt us. I call these mind whispers, actually, Guy. I've noticed them years ago. I've noticed that if we don't pay attention, there are very subtle, very fast. I mean, the brain is very fast, and there are little subtle intentions that come by. And if you're not really tuned into it, and I think that's what this work does, it lets us drop in to notice what's happening at a very subtle level. If you're not tuned in, they're almost like little commands that tell you what to do. Oh, go. It's more comfortable, or go to that room. It's more comfortable, or it's quieter over. And so in a way, we're subtly rejecting our experience of this moment and not being present, right? But
Yeah, this was, I really got a lot out and continuing to get a lot out of this book. And I'm not just saying that too, because the way you've structured these readings, it really does bring you back to and invites you back to who you are. So they're almost, I found them very empowering. The one I wanted to read here was to live authentically, accept your true nature. An acorn cannot grow into a palm tree no matter how hard it tries. Have others ever dictated that you become a palm or an oak or a fir? How would they know what seed lives within? Become the seed you nurture. How will you grow today? What is your heart's path? Reflect on this. And again, I mean, this was something that I felt like I needed to hear again and again and again. And I'm thinking to myself, how useful this is going to be for the people listening to this. I mean, this is one of the things I got excited about doing the series. I mean, I want to answer that, but I want you to answer, if you will, how do you think therapists and counselors and clinicians can utilize this or benefit from this?
Well, on one level, I think it's almost a workbook, and in that the reading could be something that could be used in a session related to something the client may be dealing with. And then there are 3 questions or prompts on the opposite page, and those can be journaled during the week. They can be reflected on in a session. But each of those prompts is designed to get the individual using the book going more deeply into thinking about this this reflection, and also think about how they can put that into action. So the bottom of the 3 prompts is actually a bit of a practice. What I wanted to do was to make this really something that was very interactive for people, that they could start to explore. And I think and maybe that's the other reason for this book, is I think you can do great work with in a session with a client, but when they leave your office and they rush back out into the swirl and chaos of their world, they might leave that behind. I think this is a way to help people keep some nugget, to stay connected to what happened in that session, so that they could then take it out and they say, okay, I want you to think about, reflect on this during the week, on this particular, or journal these questions during the week. So it's something they take with them when they leave the office and they bring back into mind, and they can explore more deeply and think about how it's impacting their relationships, how is it maybe changing their relationship to themselves. Um, even this one here, the oak or the palm tree. Well, I found that that's very powerful thought for a lot of people as to how, am I trying to force a round peg into a square, or a square peg into a round socket, right? Who am I?
Right.
How can I be okay with that? And am I pushing in the wrong direction in my life? No, I went through a period of that myself where um, I found a lot of doors were closing on me. I was going in the wrong direction. It was really interesting. And then when I moved into the therapy field, I'm talking in terms of my career and my work, but I moved into the therapy field, I noticed doors started to open for me.
Mm.
And I had the realization, this is the right path, right? But I was trying to maybe force myself to do something that was not as true for me.
You were talking about how this book can be a bridge or a call to action for clients and so forth. And what also speaks to me is the invitation for therapists and clinicians to, you know, to create or cultivate that intentionality, that mindfulness. Um, but and it's not always easy, right? I mean, I was listening to another interview I did with the author and therapist Kathy Steele, and she was saying that she was a little disheartened by all of the modalities that are coming out. Not that there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that, but she said it almost prevents people from asking the sacred questions.
Mm,
And I think
yeah.
what you're doing here is really creating a space for the therapist, him or herself, to do that with themselves. And it's not always easy. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I, Thank you for saying that. Actually, because I think what's happening in therapy is the therapy field is becoming very mechanistic in some way, and that's a danger. Is to just get, oh, you do this, you do this, you do this. It's evidence-based, right? But I think that to create a sacred space to allow people to tap into mind, body, spirit is essential to healing. I think that we are modern day shamans in this field. And shamans don't just work with one particular part of a person, but they work with the whole person. And also there's the idea in looking at these reflections is that there's really nothing to fix. I think often, and I had this misconception as a therapist for a long time, people are coming to me, they want to be fixed, I've got to fix them. There's nothing to fix. And when you come to that realization, nothing to fix, but just to see yourself completely, it's a shift. And I think that's what this work can do, is to help people shift and to help make therapy a place of integrated healing in a way. I think you could still use the things that you're, if you're a CBT person or whatever it is that you're working with, but bring in the whole person. And I think this can also help the therapist connect with their whole being and to bring that into the therapy room. So I think that is very healing. I found that to sit with, and a lot of this book is about how do I bring presence to this, whatever's happening around me.
Mm-hmm.
You sit in presence with another person. It is, I mean, that person right before you, like I'm looking at you and I'm connecting with you, even across electrons through space. But I feel that I'm here with you.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that with anybody, recognize that the one before you is the most unique person in all of the universe. What a gift. and to see that gift in every person that you meet, every client, and to have a presence with them. And that, I think, is a wonderful way to connect with others and also build this presence and compassion. And that's my basic, what I hope this book can bring. But I like what you said about sacred space, that this can bring in the idea of the whole mind, body, spirit, because there are ways to get into the body in the book as well.
Do you think, or how do you think this book can help a therapist or clinician cultivate presence? Because I think it's one thing, we talk about, authenticity and presence are important. And one of the questions I've always had on this is, okay, yeah, but what does that look like? How do we do that? How does one do that? And how would you respond to that? How can this book maybe help someone cultivate that?
I think this book has a lot of different readings that get us out of the head. And
Out of the head. Okay.
Out of the head, right.
Right.
And into what's happening in the body, in our senses. And because we can get lost up here. And then when we get lost up here, we're thinking we have a lot of mental constructs and ways of, and we think that we're maybe feeling things, but we're feeling them through a mental roadmap. And so I think that a lot of presence is to get into the body. A lot of times when I've been with clients, if I'm present in the body, I'm also in a way experiencing what that client is experiencing. So I have asked at times, I'll say, I'm feeling a tightness in my gut here. Are you feeling that? And most of the times I hear a confirmation, yeah, that's what I'm experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are able to get present in that way, you're picking up more of the experience of your clients. You're really kind of dissolving. I think one of the other things in this book is it helps dissolve that the illusion of individual separateness that we like to think we have. And I think all humans have that. And I think it may be particularly strong in the Western culture where we kind of pride ourselves on individuality, right? So to kind of soften to that individual self. And I think this is a process of softening, of not having so strong an ego identification or an egocentric perspective on things. And when you drop that, you connect more, you open, you can listen. If I'm filled up with my thoughts, how can I hear what you're saying? Mm-hmm. So this is a really different way of being. I think that's maybe what this book cultivates, is a different way of being. And what I wanted to do was to create something. I mean, I have sat in meditation for many, many hours, and I know that's a luxury for a lot of people. So I tried to find really concise ways of kind of prying open some of those fixed ways that we may be viewing ourselves, kind of pry them open, let a little, give that little air, little spaciousness to it, and experience our being in a different way. To see our connection with others differently.
Yeah, I mean, and listening to you talk, Donald, I'm thinking to myself, how useful that is going to be for a therapist, but also if a therapist or clinician or coach, whatever, is doing that, is embodying that, how useful that then can be for the work they're doing with their client. So, like you said, this is not just a tool to be used in therapy, if you will, but also something for the clinician, for the therapist. And I love it. I mean, when I was reading this, no joke. I mean, it slowed me down. It really said, wait a minute, it demanded my attention, because it
Hmm.
made me start thinking about, or feeling, as in this last one I read, who am I, and to be okay with that. And sometimes that's even a challenge for myself, that I shouldn't be this or do that or that. And I can just see, you're talking about here being with someone and feeling, resonating, right? That's so powerful.
Oh yeah, it is. That's why I think that, I mean, what does it really mean to be human? Right? That we're not little machines. We're not widgets, and but we're, think in all this universe. Here we are, conscious beings in this vast universe, and that we can find joy. We can reduce suffering here, and I think that's the other aspect to this book, that sometimes we don't recognize our suffering. Mindfulness often is I think too often is taught as a tool for I can be more productive. I can um, uh, be less stressed or whatever, and that's fine. But the essence of, really, the real purpose of it is to reduce suffering and understand suffering. And
Mhm.
so through these practices, you start to notice, oh, how am I creating this misery for myself? How am I grabbing on to these thoughts that are counterproductive, that anxiety, rumination? Um, you can, and again, not to necessarily reject those part of your mind, but to shine the light and to see it is a revelation for a lot of people. And 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 that can slow us down. And I think that's the other thing here is just we just take a breath, feel how nice that is, and
Mhm.
just pause. And if we just pause and reflect inward, um, we're touching that most human part of ourselves.
When you were talking about, mindfulness in terms of relieving suffering, I guess say a little bit more about that. Are you saying that the tension or the constriction or the suffering that we bring upon ourselves is kind of alleviated when we bring intentionality to it? Talk more about that, if you will.
Yeah, I think that what happens is when we bring attention to the nature of our own mind and how reactive it can get, uh, that we don't have to react. We can notice that. We can have compassion for ourselves. Oh, this is where my mind goes under this kind of situation, or I'm in this pressure. Um, I have this pressure at work, and so this is creating this inner environment. But that inner environment is also connected to the outer environment. And so you can approach it in many different ways. You can try to, by not reacting and just noticing all of that within yourself, you can find some inner constructive space from those thoughts to see them, but honor them, but also notice that um, you can take action in the moment that maybe can alleviate that stress in the workplace too. So it's not just about helping me, deal with stress, but saying, how can I connect with others in such a way to change the environment around me too? Not in an imposing way. And I think that's also important here, but in a cooperative way. I think mindfulness helps us cooperate with others better and
Hmm.
not try to impose our way of, I think things should be this way or that way, but to uh, be mutually open and respectful of others. I think that it can bring a new sense of civility into our lives in a lot of regards. So it's kind of an inner outer process, but we start within. We start to notice what's happening within. If you have a war in your mind, you're going to bring that war outside, like very likely. if you can cultivate a mind of peace, a mind of that is more at ease with itself, making friends with yourself, being at ease with this is who I am, right? And this is who I can nurture. This is who I can grow, and see the beneficial aspects of what you're doing. Noticing your strengths, for example, as I think too often. That's another interesting idea here, is that when you start to observe yourself, you can start to also observe the good things that are there. We can get stuck on a negative soundtrack very easily. And, we can talk about the brain science behind that, neurons that wire together, fire together, and right. But what is in the field of focused attention actually is how the brain gets wired. So by getting more present, focusing on the positive things that are in your life, also changes that soundtrack. So we have a full menu of items we can look at in life. And all I'm saying is let's decide how to be uh, uh, more masterful or more skillful at how we're paying attention.
Again, as you're talking, I can't help but think how almost profound this type of work can be for someone who's working with people someone who's been impacted by trauma. Again and again, on this podcast, we've talked about, as you and I talked about before, the usefulness of techniques and interventions and modalities, and yet alongside that, with that, the strength of being able to connect with someone, period, being able to resonate with someone, period, and that just doesn't happen. I mean, one presence has to be there, compassion has to be there, authenticity has to be there, and that's not always easy. I'll just share this, and I have before, when I was starting out, fresh out of graduate school, even while I was in graduate school, I wanted to learn everything I could about trauma. I wanted to take all this information in, and it wasn't that I didn't know about the value of authenticity and genuineness and so forth, but I didn't understand its role within this context. And I had to learn that, the hard way. I was, one supervisor at one point said, if you're going to be working with these kids, and I was working at a job where we were seeing kids who were showing early signs of psychosis, he said, you've got to be willing to take off your clinical hat. And I thought this guy was nuts. Here was, I just got my degree, but he was referring to being able to be who you are, yourself. And this book really struck that chord with me. And it's, as I've said, it's not always easy, because I think clinicians want to fix, they get into this position because they want to, quote unquote, do good, but that has to be defined. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I really appreciate what you've done here with this book.
Oh, thank you. And and my hope is that it can really get people into that more real part of themselves and connect with others, that this isn't just about changing myself, but giving myself a new view of everything almost. It's a major shift in perspective from that can take us out of feeling like we're locked in to this particular way of doing things or seeing things. And that's what my experience was. Again, bringing it back to Uthilananda, that monk that I met, was that inner transformation became something that made a difference out in the world. And his sense of availability and compassion and presence let me understand a different way, that we didn't have to be measured by our productivity. And I think that's very much part of our cultural milieu, is being, how much did I accomplish today?
Mm-hmm.
Measure ourselves by that. But just instead of saying, what kind of human being was I today? Right? How did I connect with someone today? Uh, uh, how did I make a difference? How did I maybe what I like to call light another person's candle? Because we have so much to share, and with almost anyone. And how can what do we have to give away? Uh, Either part of ourselves or a part of our knowledge or expertise or just an openness. Just listening to another is a gift, or sharing with another person a strength that you notice in them. Um, it's a beautiful way to connect. And I think ultimately that's what humans are here to do, is to help uh, bring some light
No,
into the world.
no. All right, Donald, love it. The book is called Reflect, Awaken to Wisdom of the Here and Now. Donald Altman is my guest today. Trauma Therapist podcast listeners can get 20% off by going to www.pesi.com/Altman. That's pesi.com/Altman, and use the discount code TTP20. That's TTP20. Donald, thank you so much. It was an honor having you on here, man. This is
Oh, thanks, Guy.
is what my podcast is about. This and the author series is, I love it. So thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome, and it's great making this connection.
All right, take care.